So I made a video the other day about those issues which I feel are a weakness for the West, for the UK, and arguably for the West generally. Although there is variation factors between from country to country. Germany is not equal to the the UK is not equal to the US, and so on. There is obviously variations, but there is also some general problems I think can be seen in the West, and I'm sure I can expand on that video and add points to it. But given the current climate, I thought it would be appropriate and timely to discuss Russia's weaknesses because I think there is this perception that we are going up against a big Russian bear and it's kind of reckless. That perception is mostly coming from those under the misguided notion that we started this current state of tension. We did not. Russia started this when they decided to carry out a nerve agent attack on our soil. But leaving that aside, that's the perception. Well, let me start with the basic truth. And the basic truth is that the Russian Federation is a powerful country. There is no way around that. It is a powerful country. It's a member of the G20. It's got one of the largest militaries in the world, certainly in the top five. It's got the largest number of nuclear warheads, although there's varying degrees of the exact capabilities. But it's got the largest number of nuclear warheads, even more than the United States. Time magazine estimated it to be 7,000, and there's different figures available. And it's definitely got a renewed sense of confidence in on some level. At least that's the outside perception since Putin took over. All of this is true. So it would always be a mistake to underestimate the Russian Federation. Russia is a very proud nation. Russia is a nation that's engaged in many brutal wars. Russia is a nation that sacrificed enormously in both world wars, particularly the Second World War. Massive losses on the Eastern Front. So all of that is true and should be acknowledged. But I think sometimes there's this notion with very powerful countries or potential superpowers that they are all powerful. Now, is Russia enough to be classed as a superpower today? It depends how you define this in terms of geopolitics. Technically speaking, the United States remains the only de facto superpower, but China and Russia certainly can compete with the United States in some areas. In some areas, the United States is soaring ahead in other areas, but in some areas, China and Russia are both very powerful countries. But sticking with Russia for this video, I've just looked at a number of barometers of international rankings just to get a kind of grasp of power. What do we perceive by power? What do we perceive by how a nation's power is defined? Well, if you look at militarily alone, then yes, Russia is a very powerful country. But North Korea also has a very large military. And I think most people would acknowledge that North Korea is not exactly a progressive, strong country insofar as human progress. Now, I'm not suggesting that Russia is the same as North Korea, but there is some pretty striking statistics that come up in international rankings. And I'm going to quote a few here. Economically, Russia is well below a lot of other great powers. It ranks 12th in terms of nominal GDP, 49th in per capita terms. That makes it a middle income country. So the average Russian is better off than the average Somali, but they're not as well off as the average Japanese or German. Somewhere around the middle. I would rank Russia probably higher middle. But there you go. 49th per capita, 12th in nominal GDP. That's quite important because in a post World War II era, economics is increasingly important. Now, Putin did galvanize Russia somewhat after the Yeltsin years, and there was a bit of a Russian boom. Every country experiences ups and downs. You don't need to be an economist to see that. So perhaps it is one of Putin's more positive aspects. He did help the Russian economy somewhat. But the fact of the matter is, Russia is not as strong economically as Britain or the United States or Germany or Japan or France, and several other countries. Um, Moscow is never going to be a major financial center in the same way as London or New York City. That's the first factor. Now, reporting this is extremely important because the progress of a nation isn't, to me, just about military power. It's also about human progress and transparency. Because if you get a situation where a country doesn't have transparency, has authoritarianism, and has rampant corruption, all issues which Russia faces, then at some point people are going to resent that. And whilst there may be a facade of strength, at some point that is going to cause serious problems for the power system in that country. Now, where does Russia rank? Reporters Without Borders, which is a well established, well respected organization for monitoring press freedom around the world, ranks Russia 148th in the world. Just to compare, the UK ranks 40th. We're not perfect. There's other European countries that rank higher than us, but we're 40th, Russia is 148th. That's very important because if journalists cannot ask their government questions, if they cannot hold the powerful to account, if they cannot scrutinize those in power, you don't have transparency. Therefore, corruption cannot be effectively monitored. There's no power accountability, not in the same way. And eventually, that leads to resentment. And rather than creating stability, it creates, actually, in the long term, it will create unease and possibly disorder and instability, because there's this long held view that strong men provide stability for a country, strong men like Putin, and if we look at the situation in the Arab world, the likes of Mubarak, Gaddafi, and others. That's true to an extent, insofar as they can provide the facade of stability and they rule through fear. And there's a degree of respect built around personality cults. I've no doubt many Russians genuinely admire Putin because they believe that he has strengthened their country. But there is a certain degree of a facade around that because this is based on a personality cult. And because Russian media is so sycophantic towards Putin, because they're so unquestioning of Putin, then it's virtually, he's not going to face scrutinization in the same way as some of his Western counterparts. So, in a way, that is a weakness of Putin individually, Putin personally. You could argue he's super sensitive because the Russian media will not question him. It's not exactly comparable to the situation in China. Putin will do question and answer sessions, but those question and answer sessions are very much set up to be in his favor. I mean, you know, you just need to look at some of these events to see right through it. Um, it's so obvious. Um, Corruption perception index. This is very important. This is not exactly the same as the exact levels of corruption, but basically, corruption perception is a way of looking at the perceived corruption in the country, i.e., ease of doing business and the confidence that multinationals, businesses, and so on have of basically trading in a country, and business people, diplomats, and so on. The UK ranks 10th, Russia ranks 131st. Now, let's say there is flaws in that, and Russia's not quite as corrupt as that perception. Let's knock 10 off that and say, okay, maybe it's 120th, maybe it's 100th. Whatever way you look at it, the perception is Russia is an extremely corrupt country. Organized crime is rife. That's why Russia has much lower tourism levels, or at least I believe it's one of the reasons why it has much lower tourism levels than Britain or France or Germany. It's not that Russia has no culture. Russia has a rich history. Russia has world class museums, but crime is very, very high, and it's not a safe country. So, all of these things definitely weaken Russia's progress. Militarily, let me come back to that. Yes, Russia has a huge military. Yes, they have a huge amount of equipment. They far more tanks, for example, than we do. They far more fighter crafts. They far more, let's face it, of a lot of things. I'm not going to deny that. But the morale of Russian troops is a major point of contention. Russian troops are treated like dirt. If you look at documentaries on this, they really are not. There's this perception that, after World War II, there was a great patriotic war. Russia had enormous losses, and veterans, went to the veteran parades and so on, and ostensibly they were treated well. But if you look at more recent conflicts, especially under the Putin era, look at the way that Russian troops were treated in Chechnya. I mean, in the first Chechen war, well, just going before Putin, they went into Grozny ill prepared. They were left to burn in their tanks, literally, because they were not trained to fight these Chechen guerrillas. In the second Chechen war, Putin was determined that wouldn't happen, but there was still huge issues around morale. In the Beslan school siege, what happened was the relatives actually ended up blaming the Russian government rather than the terrorists who were responsible. Um, but the point there is actually the level of faith people have in Putin is a question of debate. Certainly, the facade would be that he's got enormous public support. But I do wonder what the real statistics actually are. I think probably there is a majority of Russians support Putin, but I also suspect it might not be quite as high as Russian state media would have us believe. Let's not forget there have been huge public scandals. The Kursk disaster, the Kursk submarine disaster in 2000, the Beslan school siege, the still contentious issues around the apartment bombings in 1999. These are all issues that the Kremlin has tried its level best to censor and to, block discussion of. Russia doesn't even count the number of troops who have died in Syria. Some sources suggest it could be as many as 300. Um, we don't know for sure because the Kremlin doesn't count. So when you take all of this together, how powerful is Russia? I would say, yes, it's a powerful country, but there's also clear desperation there. When Russian state media is going out of its way to wage this propaganda war against Britain and the West in general, when it is going out of its way to vilify this country, then that stinks of desperation. When they have headquarters in London and Washington, and all their output is presenting Russia in a positive light and presenting Western countries in a negative light and trying to stir up animosity and trying to stir up conspiracy theories and present Putin in as best a light as possible. That to me is not strength, that is weakness. That is a sign of lacking confidence because a truly confident nation wouldn't have to do that. So you could say that demonstrates Russian state power, and it does to some extent because it shows the level of their tentacles, to interfere in the society of other countries, which is really what it is. But on the other hand, it can indicate desperation. I would say what we're seeing from Putin right now is more desperation than real, genuine strength. And I would be interested in seeing what the actual real figures of support are for Putin. I still think he would probably have a majority of Russians on his side, but I think that majority has been going down over the years, and there is genuine unease on the streets. But it's not like people are just going to come out and say that. This is an authoritarian state which has virtually no free media. So you have to take all those things into consideration. I would say Russia, yes, it's a powerful country, but it's also a country acting out of desperation in some ways. So that power is not unlimited, it's not unquestionable, and I would say Putin personally does not have infinite power. He's a very powerful man, no question about it. By some ways of looking at it, he is probably the most powerful man in the world. But every strong man has a limit. That includes Putin. And this is not going to last forever. And Russians should be well aware of that. In many league tables, Britain is well ahead of Russia. That's a fact. Militarily, we may not look like we're as strong as Russia, but firstly, the talk of war. There's not going to be a war between Britain and Russia. That is not going to happen. But what is happening is a propaganda war pushed by the Kremlin. I think we need to fight back. I think we need to really, really hit hard against the likes of RT. We may not be able to ban them, but I think, for example, we should put a disclaimer. If they're broadcasting here, this is a Kremlin funded network, that's a fact. Put it there as a disclaimer. then people can make their own mind up. But Russia is not all powerful, and anyone with some common sense can see that. So I would just suggest people look at international rankings before assuming that Russia under Putin is all powerful. It's not.